Welcome. This will be my spoiler-free review of the 1995 Worms United, the very first Worms game. I am not 100% certain about the rating, but I think it might be E for everyone. Certainly this video will be, and it would make a lot of sense. It's not really a game that has much objectionable material, if any, by American standards anyway. And this is a game I really love. Yeah, we are doing another series. I'm not doing every single Worms game, but right now the schedule is about once a month. Gonna do the ones I currently have access to, which are ones that were on sale and where the reviews were reasonable. There's at least one that I am not doing because it was so negatively received. I guess a good place to start is just, I mostly played the GOG version, but then I remembered that I owned the Steam version, so I gave that a whirl, and turns out these are basically the same, even though the one on Steam is just called Worms. I'm not entirely sure why. As far as I can tell, the only difference is that if you don't do anything, the version on Steam will not play all the same videos. Like, it'll still play a video before a level starts, but it's not going to play, when you fire up the game, for example, it's supposed to play like 3 or 4 different videos. And if you don't do anything, that won't happen on the Steam. It will on the GOG. I read that there is a fix. I did not implement it because, frankly, I didn't need to see the videos each time that, yeah. Anyway, but right, other than that, honestly, it ran smoother on Steam. It was slightly more responsive, controls and such. One thing was, at least once in a cutscene, I did see on the Steam version there was a tiny bit of like graphical glitching, but it was very, very minor. Hard hat and pickaxe and everything, and that never happened on the GOG one. But if you have a choice, if they're both on sale, I would say go with the Steam version. I don't think I've ever played the ununited Worms, ited Worms, but apparently there are some, pluses to getting United, and at this point, I'm not sure you really have a choice. I think you have to look hard to find one of the versions that is like the very original one. I did see some saying that this has a level generator, and I have not been able to find one in Worms United. I know that some of the later entries have it. So basically, I'm going to try not to make this review come across as just being annoyed that I'm not already playing Worms Armageddon, because that is the one that I've spent the most time on. It's the one I'm used to, and as I think we can all agree, it is a more refined version. I saw at least one person say that they preferred the art style for the Worms in this one, and I respect that. We all have a right to be wrong about important things, but that's obviously a joke. Sometimes people take me seriously when I feel like it's obvious that I'm kidding. Anyway, if you like that art style, that's fine. And you should try not to be wrong about important things. That one is not important. Other than that, yeah, I would certainly argue that the various changes I personally find to all be improvements, but I will mention them. I'm not going to belabor, even though I have a tendency to do that. What I will say is, if you are not basically just, completist like myself, or doing it for historical purposes or something, I would probably say to start with one of the sequels. Honestly, from what I recall, even the second one is, yeah, much, much more, yeah. With that said, it is not a bad game. You can absolutely understand why this was popular enough that it spawned all these sequels. In fact, when I was a child, I thought that if you cut a Worms game in half, then both halves were just as alive as the original. And then later I heard that it's a little more complicated than that, because adults like to lie to children instead of just saying it's a little more complicated, but here's what we'll tell you for now, which makes things more confusing than they need to be. Anyway, the I think a good way to illustrate the tone here is to simply say a little bit about the sort of, I guess, the opening, one of the opening videos. Let's go with that. It is I think, boarding school, but I'm not an expert. I've never been to one, which I'm quite relieved about, and so is everyone who would have ended up having to be around me in a boarding school if I had been in one. But certainly the kids all have these uniforms. The teacher or principal or something is very angry. Everyone has detention. And the camera keeps showing this one kid with this imp-like grin on his face from different angles. And, the teacher is like yelling. Yeah, the guy is yelling at them saying, "Stop sniggering." And then this kid, walks towards this authority figure, and everyone's like staring. It's like, ooh. And then he turns with one of those wonderful morph animations that T2 had made popular and were everywhere, like genuinely inescapable during the 90s in media, that was at all trying to appeal to a younger audience and felt like they could work it in, even if awkwardly. He morphs into a worm and starts, looks just not a actual real life earthworm, but one of the ones from this game, and gets weapons out. And then the authority figure also, he looks very upset. The worm like does the raised eyebrow, or I guess what do you call it? Yeah, the eyebrow goes like this, not just raises and stays in place. And then the authority figure also turns into a worm, and we also get, it says, the worm has turned. I think that's where that says, which I have never been able to make sure if, is that a reference to the movie Wolf from the 1990s? The worm has turned and is packing an Uzi? Because in this it has. What was it about the 1990s and earthworms in media that was, somewhat edgy, but, somewhat else, more or less for kids? Because you also had the Earthworm Jim franchise. Anyway, yeah, that's the sort of goofy, absurdist sense of humor. It is more random in the Earthworm Jim games, but there is definitely, yeah, and this sort of anti-authoritarian streak. And also, both before at the very start of the game, before it goes to the menu, it will play one specific one, and then each time you start a level, it will play one at random, basically, you know, pre-rendered, well, yeah, fully animated, not just, it's not in-engine. We have these 3D cutscenes of worms in the battlefield, and basically each time there's at least one, like, classic Looney Tunes cartoon physics humor kind of joke. Not always physics, but a joke that feels right out of some, there is one that is genuinely like Wile E. Coyote, complete with the, not gravity not applying before they realize, oh wait, I'm no longer on solid ground, kind of thing. And I guess this is a good time to briefly bring up. So I'm afraid that I do not recall its title, and my wrists are too sore to check right now. But basically, the original, sort of the prototype version of this, and it wasn't meant to be that, but years before this one came out, there was a game where I believe the original version were basically two King Kongs throwing monkeys, throwing bananas at each other, and they couldn't move, but they could adjust the angle and what's it called again? The power of the throw. And yeah, I've right now actually forget if it was two-player or if it was one player against a AI opponent. Maybe both were possible. And, understandably that became popular. It actually is. I think a lot of young people today probably don't even know much. Well, let's see. I think they have made some fairly recent games in this franchise, but certainly the idea of, static, the player character is static and can do these ranged attacks where angle and power are what it's all about. Right, to be clear, when I'm saying power here, what I mean is how hard they will throw the thing, and in some of these games it's shooting. In this game also, so shooting sometimes. But basically, because there's a bunch of like mobile games now that have that, and I am glad to see that that still lives on, because it's one of those kind of really, really clever game setups, because it's so easy to get, you immediately understand it. You're not necessarily going to be great at it right away. It might help you with math, but there's good reasons to play it as well, even if you do hate math, as you should. But basically, that game, this is a sort of spiritual successor to that, because in this one you can move. It's not only bananas, and in fact a lot of the time you're not going to have the banana, even though it is epic when you do have a banana in this game. Was this review written by a monkey? And the, let's see, I guess that is more or less that. So yeah, basically, a bunch of worms are at war, and they have a variety of weapons, and I really appreciate the way that the weapons all, like, I've seen some people say, oh, this one is just useless. I don't know. Maybe in some of the sequels, I would argue in this one, there's a use for each of them. It's just that some of them you fairly rarely need and or are very difficult to use. I guess this is a good place to just briefly mention. So one of the ways that the later ones improve is that in this one, so in several of these, I haven't played all of them yet, or there's a bunch I haven't played. I've played these first three, and I think demos of some of them later ones, but I do not even remember which ones those are. But something that is consistent across multiple of these is that you have limited ammunition for ammunition is GTA thing, ammunition for a number of the weapons. And in 2 and Armageddon is essentially the third one, what they do is you just can't see the thing that you don't have ammo for, and I am very glad that they made that change. I don't know why they didn't think of it for this one, because, see, the thing is, there's like a dozen or more I didn't sit down count exactly different, especially if you count both weapons and tools, and you might have very limited time. Like sometimes you'll start a match and you'll have 15 seconds to not only decide but carry out your attack. And if you have to spend several seconds just finding out what you even have access to, when in the later ones it's at a glance, But yeah, that is one thing. Moving on. But basically, I'm not going to go over all of them. Don't worry. But enough to illustrate. Basically, you tend to have access to at least the bazooka. And that one is a great all-rounder. Basically, before I talk too much about the weapons, I do have to explain. So one of the interesting things here is that it is not always about hitting your opponent. Sometimes it is more beneficial to aim very close to them, because certain weapons can be really effective at pushing the opponent into danger, but if you hit the opponent without putting them into danger, that's not going to do very much. The environment is destructible, and if a worm goes underwater, they will immediately die. That's the primary thing I mean about pushing them into danger, but there is also such a thing as fall damage, even if they don't land in water, and there are mines, and the mines are affected by proximity to a worm, one or more worms, and under certain circumstances you can make a worm bounce between them. You can make a worm go flying from your initial attack, hit one mine, then another mine, and eventually fly right out of the border of the level, which is another instant death. So the bazooka, which you can adjust how powerful how much power you are firing it with, which means that you can arc it. It is indeed possible. You'll want to keep a close eye on the indicator for wind, both the intensity and the direction of it. But it is possible, if you are under an enemy worm, to fire up and get it to make a turn, and it does a good amount of damage to the environment. A direct hit is also quite powerful, but on some, there are times where the enemy will have so much health that it just makes more sense to try to aim for the ground near them and, move their worm into danger like that. Other than that, you have, I already mentioned the Uzi. Yeah, that one, it's especially good for pushing. It fires for several seconds. It does not do as much damage as Uzis in a lot of other games do. There's a shotgun, which has 2 shots, and the benefit of doing just enough aerial damage that if an enemy worm is fairly close to the edge, you might be able to, it might take 2 shots, and it might also be a case where if you are able to, the thing with, the 2 shots, most of the time, 1 turn means 1 shot. With a shotgun, if you are able to use 1 shot to knock one of the enemy worms off an edge or something, perhaps close to another worm, maybe you can use the second shot to get the other worm to, hit the other worm so that they're both in the same place, making it easier to attack both of them, or more difficult for that worm to spread out as much, or that team spread out as much, Or maybe you can knock it off one edge onto another precarious edge and then take out the other edge. I guess there's also decent time to talk about. You definitely want to be careful not to hit the ground too close to you, because that can damage you. Let's see, I think in this one you don't usually lose your turn. In some of the later ones you do also lose your turn if you accidentally harm yourself. Or purposefully, because sometimes it's funny. And it is definitely a game where, and that is not unique to this one. It goes for 2 and Armageddon as well. Sometimes it really looks like you are safe and home free, and then it turns out, oh, there was actually a tiny bit of the environment left, and you just hit it with your projectile, and maybe even took damage. Certainly, you weren't able to hit the enemy quite like you hoped, that sort of thing. And yeah, it's a lot of the time in these three, it is very high risk, high reward, and you find yourself really kicking yourself if you were like, I don't think I could do this, and then didn't try, and then end up not having the chance again in that entire match, maybe for several more matches. There's just enough randomization going on. I think I'll talk a little bit more about the weapons than more about the randomization, but yeah, other than that, okay, I would be remiss if I did not mention there is a minigun. It is essentially just a more powerful version of the Uzi, so I'm not going to go too much into it. There are multiple grenades, and they can also be arced, or not quite arced, but and they can bounce. You can set, I think it's anywhere between 1 and 5 second fuses, and there's a regular one. There's one that has a sort of cluster bomb effect, where when it I think it is called the cluster grenade. When it explodes, a bunch of smaller ones pop out, and that is also how the banana works. It is just a incredibly powerful version of it. If you are able to drop a banana near multiple enemy worms, like the one thing you want to be careful about is if it's a fairly if there's not very high to the ceiling, then they might just end up exploding in the same place, which can also work, but it's especially effective if it's out in the open, because each of these bananas are so powerful, they can have the worms just flying off. They might go flying off in different directions. I've seen with my own eyes things people wouldn't believe. Lost in Tears in the Rain, so I'm going to explain it here. Basically, you can have different enemy worms go fly off the edge of the entire level from the same banana bomb. This can end a match under certain circumstances. And I guess that... Okay, I'm definitely going to talk a tiny bit more weapons, and then I will move on. So one of the really fun ones is also the homing missile, and that's one of the places where it's also really, like, the first time you hear about the homing missile, you might think, okay, I'm set. Just give me that one and I'll, I'm going to win this easy. Before you're really good at this, you are going to struggle. And I really appreciate about this game, because that is a thing. It was back then, it still is today. Sometimes games don't give you that much of like a good practice ground, so you kind of just have to hope a certain rare thing pops up, and then you'll in a situation where you can try it out, because sometimes they work in ways that don't, they work in mysterious ways, But in this one, before you start competing against other human players, which is one of the most fun things to do in these games, or, you can also attempt the challenge mode. I'm not going to give away exactly how many levels, but I felt like it was a pretty decent amount, and they are fun in this sort of, they escalate in difficulty. And the basic idea of the challenge mode is that you earn points when you complete one of these levels. So the more you're able, and if you lose once, that's it. So if you're able to complete all of them in one sitting, you will get the top score. And that's, of course, where the competition comes in. And it's also, there are not so many that you'll end up just being like, okay, come on, you know. And but yeah, the way to practice in this is to make a CPU poor enemy, and you know, in the team, what's it called, team creation screen, easy to find from the main menu. Yeah, make one of those. If you're really feeling like you need extra, as much help as possible, well, I mean, obviously you don't have to set it to poor. There's 3 difficulty ratings for the AI. I'm saying I would personally recommend it so that they don't wipe the floor with you immediately. You know, once you're good at it, start playing against tougher ones, obviously, and start doing challenges and playing against other players, human players. But you know, you can also give them, let's see, I think the lowest is 50 in starting health, and you could give yourself, your own team, 500 in starting health. That's going to give you a nice, you know, kind of training wheels situation kind of thing, and you can practice with all the different guns. But yeah, the homing missile, it is very important how much power you give it, because if you do not give it quite enough, it will not quite go far enough. Like it'll, it's a little difficult to explain. I'm just telling you, you know, that's one you'll definitely want to practice with. And that's also in the settings, you can tell it how much ammo you want to start with in those matches. It does not affect the challenge mode. And this is also one of those games where it is fun to start with just like every weapon, but it can also be like, you have to really think creatively. If you know, there are times where I've played where the only thing both of us players had was, for example, the bazooka, which works. Sometimes we made it that the only thing you had was something that is actually kind of difficult to injure the other player with, so you really have to get creative. And I guess that does segue nicely into the, right. Okay, before I segue into the tools, I do want to talk about, you knew it was coming, if you knew pretty much anything about the Worm series, the sheep. I don't know why they thought of a sheep. In later ones, they add more, that's later ones, not later Hosen, they add other really just like, okay, that's random. How did you even think of those kind of things as weapons and tools? But basically, yeah, the sheep, you can detonate it by pressing fire a second time. You do basically just let it go, and then it runs. You don't like throw it at a certain, you know, power or angle or anything like that. And that's one of the places where you really see the sort of unpredictability, because sometimes the sheep will literally turn and run back in your direction, and that can completely screw you, because there might not be something it might not be able to clear whatever's on the other side of you, so you might just have to blow it up and injure yourself, you know. But under the right circumstances, it's amazing. The sheep will sometimes jump, sometimes run, bleed a lot, and you can detonate it even when it is mid-air. I didn't test it this time, but I know in some of them later ones, if you don't detonate it yourself within a certain number of seconds, a countdown will appear over it, and it will explode on its own eventually. And under those circumstances, you really want to make sure you time it right. If it's yeah, but if the enemy worm is like, let's say the water's down here, the enemy worm is here, you're like up here, you can send the sheep, and then if it jumps and then it falls past, you can detonate it right above the enemy worm, you right below, you know, which might send it down, you right below, which would send it up, that sort of thing, you know. And yeah, the sort of instant win button is if you can get the enemy worm into water, which can sometimes be doing just by prodding them. That is a real friendship tester. If you're able to prod your tough-talking friend who thinks he's going to win, because it is exactly what it sounds like. You just, you go up to them and you poke them a tiny bit and they go, eh, and then they don't go very far, but sometimes that's enough, And right, I guess okay, so I do also want to mention the airstrike, which is one of those things that it can be effective, and it's one of the reasons why you may want to be careful not to have too much empty space over you. But on the other hand, if you don't have enough, that can really affect how well you can hit the enemy. And then there's, of course, the teleport, which I quite appreciate. In this one they don't do a huge amount. In later ones they do more. There are pop culture references in these. Sometimes it's also in the dialogue. Worms will say something when a turn begins at the end of one, commenting on what you did in that turn. Like, they might, sometimes they'll say first blood. Another reference, I don't have to explain what circumstance they say that in. I'll just say that it makes sense when they do. They might also say, they might say, what did you do that for, kind of thing, and they might, yeah, I'm going too much into one thing. But yeah, yes, teleportation uses the Star Trek teleportation sound, and teleportation is often very limited, and like everything else in the game, tactics, it is a trade-off, because you get yourself into a position and you can essentially choose anywhere. Like, hypothetically, if you felt like it, you could use it to just, creatively off that particular worm of your own. You can put it in midair above water, for example. But the thing is, if you put it in a place that is great for the next time you shoot from, if one of the enemies, that might be so exposed that one of the enemies is able to shoot them first, even to death. So yeah. And if you hide the worm too much, then it'll take a while to get into a good position to shoot. I forget if I haven't mentioned, but yeah, this is turn-based. You can do one thing and then, I don't know why. I guess they thought it would be more engaging, and it's a great hot seat local multiplayer game. This and the other two I mentioned, in part because a lot of the time the turns are so short, and an overall match can also be very short, but that can depend on skill, how well things go for the different players, such and such. That covers the weapons. Then you have the tools, and some of these are simply for getting into another area of the level. Did I mention the levels are randomly generated at the start, with some exceptions? Let's see. I think maybe that at least some of the challenge ones are not. But yeah, and yeah, when you're playing a regular level, if you press left, that means play. If you press right, it means it will generate a different one. It also randomly determines where the worms will start. I think maybe also which team of worms it gets to play first, and that's also a thing that can really... I have had experiences where one player would be in a huff because they didn't start, and the other player just, very easily made minced meat out of their team. And yeah, this can be a way to learn emotional regulation. You can really get to a place where you learn not to be so upset about losing, even if it is unfair. But yeah, I have seen it with my own eyes. Of course I know him, he's me. I guess it's a decent time to briefly note I don't really have a super relevant YouTube video to recommend this time, but if you haven't already watched Jenna Stober commenting on Balatro of the Year and the Weaponization of Hope, Monetization of Hope, something like that. Excellent video, slightly more upsetting than this game. I guess, do I have to say that? If you know much of anything about Balatro, you probably know where it's going. Mature topic, let's go with that. And yeah, yes, some of the tools in this are just for moving to a different place. Like there's a blowtorch which you can angle slightly. There is a pneumatic drill, which that's one of the biggest, as far as tools go, trade-offs, because if you get yourself, the pneumatic drill will get you into a hole and you might not be able to move, or at least not much after that. Yeah, as soon as you use a weapon or a tool, you're a lot of the time your turn will end right after, which does mean that you have to be careful about where you end up with it. And blowtorch and pneumatic drill, you can just prompt it to stop if you want it to stop prematurely, because that's also a thing. If you're too far down and you just let the pneumatic drill go, it will, like a lemming style, you'll end up in the water. It's not going to stop before hitting water or pay dirt. But it can be really useful because basically, if you're in a hole, you are more difficult to hit with projectiles, but if the enemy is able to throw a grenade or grenade-like into that hole, yeah, that can do, like, I already mentioned that the banana bomb, the damage can really stack on that thing. If you're in a hole that you made by a pneumatic drill and there isn't really any room down there, it's just a hole directly down, and the enemy throws a banana bomb that lands on you, or at least very close to you, that could be it. Like, you'll be hit by all of those bananas. And then you'll start questioning the nutritional value of them, because it doesn't seem to be doing your worm a lot of good. And other than that, we have the girder, which, that's a thing. If you're playing this today and you haven't played before and you're used to something like Worms Armageddon, it works a tiny bit different here. But if you just practice with it, you'll get there. It does, I think it can still do pretty much all the same things. You can change the length of it, the angle of it. Basically in this one, let's see, I think it's that the mouse is the one that cycles through the aforementioned, where in Armageddon, let's see, I think it's the arrow keys, which is normally how left and right are how you walk, up and down is angling, and also the ninja rope, which is one of my personal favorites. Of all the things you have access to in this, it's probably my absolute favorite. Basically, you shoot a rope, and then you can choose how to, yeah, you angle it very carefully, and you can go swinging like on a vine or something, and you choose how fast, the up down is for extending and closing in on the rope, and basically the further out you are to a certain degree, the more speed you can build, and you can get yourself, like, hypothetically, I'm going to have to illustrate this lightly. Let's say you want to get to up here, you're down here, so you shoot to here. If you just, like, go all the way up with the rope, you're not going to be able to just, get up here. But if you hang down here and then you start swinging, you may be able to swing it so far that you can get up here, and you may have to let go of the rope while you are swinging in order to accomplish that. And yeah. I guess I'll also briefly note, I don't think in this one you can, as you can in Armageddon, and possibly the second. It's been so many years since I played that one. The in some of the later ones, you can drop a throwable and then use the rope to retreat. You can, while using the rope, you can drop throwable and then engage the rope to retreat. Other than that, you also have you do have the option to skip your turn if you'd like. I forget if this one has an outright surrender button, but that's something I would like to see. I've never really thought it made a lot of sense for Americans to hate the French as they do. And obviously it's fine to hate them. They're not a minority group or something. They've done awful things. I don't need to list them. I'm just saying you can look it up on your own. There's awful things they've done. They've also done some great contributions to culture when they are not. Can I say that on an E for everything video? I guess I can't. You probably know what I'm talking about. There's one major aspect where I really hope they, as a culture, will just decide let's not even say we did. Let's admit that we used to, but stop doing it at all. But a lot of the time, Americans have no idea why they hate the French. They've just been told to, and a lot of Americans do as they're told, even if they don't realize it. And then they get mad at us leftists for being like, you should probably do this instead. That would actually be the beneficial thing. Did that make it sound like I'm saying I don't think Americans are leftists? That's obviously not what I mean. I worded it weirdly. Anyway, a lot of Americans like to say, the French, they always surrender. Maybe from now on, we should say, instead of saying the French always surrender, we should say Trump always surrenders. Sometimes later than he should, but he is very wishy-washy. What was it they called him? Taco? I'm looking forward to him doing that on Iran, because obviously it can really get to... Yeah, so someone pointed out he boldly tweeted that he is in favor of forever war. He wants to be the forever war president, when that is one of the most unpopular things in recent decades of American politics. So yeah, he is spiraling, and I look forward to him no longer being in office. I'm not hoping for anything bad to happen to him. I would prefer if he engaged in restorative justice for the rest of his life, but it is quite clear he is very harmful to the country and the rest of the world, and the people that support him, the ever dwindling number of them. Anyway, I guess that does more or less cover the tools. Yeah, I think that does bring us to the so yeah, some of the if you play a regular match and you don't adjust ammo and such, you will start with a number that is not necessarily, you're going to be like, I wish I had more ammo for this. And again, you can, but it is also one of those, like sometimes I'll play a game and I'm like, really, I'm already out of ammo? This is one of the ones where I'm like, you know what, I'll find another way. And the challenges also have very specific numbers of ammo, which is also part of why you really don't want that to be the first time. Like, I remember there's at least one where you have a bunch of sheep. That should not be the first time you encounter the sheep. You'll want to master the sheep. You'll want to be a shepherd by then. And so a lot of the time you can cycle between them, and I'll say at first I wasn't sure that was a thing in this one. It is in 2 and Armageddon, but the thing is they don't have the arrow that in 2 and Armageddon, or at least Armageddon, I remember for sure, if you can cycle between the worms, you use tab for that, you will see this I guess it's almost like the recycle symbol, the 2 arrows pointing towards each other in this sort of, Ouroboros sort of way. In this one, that will simply never appear. But the fact that an arrow points to the worm you're currently controlling neither means for sure that you can or cannot cycle to a different one. So that's, again, something I wish they had changed, especially since sometimes you have 15 seconds is not an exaggeration, by the way. Sometimes that is your time for the turn, and you cannot see because you have to point to each individual weapon and tool in order to see how much, if any, ammo you have for it. I don't know why they didn't add bare minimum. Like, just put like a cross over it or a 0 next to it or something. It takes 15 seconds if you want to scroll past every single one of them and see if they are all, yeah. Anyway, I think that does cover. There is a right. So yeah, the camera is to the side, and you can, if you move the mouse, you can see further than you would otherwise. And otherwise, the camera moves as the worm does. The controls are very quick and easy to get into, not to mention for the way control schemes were at the time, at least, intuitive. And honestly, this was a pretty good example of streamlining. There's not too many different... I guess, honestly, part of it is the fact that in order to choose between weapons and tools and all that stuff, you just right-click. And I was trying to get confused the first time, but if you only... Yeah. If you right-click one of the other ones, in 2 or Armageddon, if you right-click once, you bring up the menu, you can see every weapon or tool you have in your arsenal. If you right-click again, you'll just go back. In this one, no matter how many times you right-click, that's never going to bring you back out of it. You have to choose something, and then you can continue moving. But if you right-click once, you bring up weapons. Right-click a second time, you bring up tools. If you want to go back to weapons, just right-click again. And that, of course, means that we don't have to memorize all the different buttons for all the different weapons and tools, which, no, if you weren't there, you might not know. You obviously don't remember. In the 90s, there were times where you had to memorize a bunch of different keys, and then today in games, it's just like, no, you just go to a place where you need that thing, and then you press a button. Or that sort of thing, if it's something that you're not using all the time, but you used to have to remember the keys for all these different things. It was absolutely ridiculous. I think some of these game developers, they looked at the fact that, you have a keyboard, there's the entire alphabet, and a bunch of, it's 12 function keys. Challenge accepted. In movement, you can also jump, and that's another thing where, so as mentioned, I'm not saying this game is bad, just they did a really great job iterating, improving in later. And again, I'm very happy that I played all the way through this. But there's only one type of jump. You press enter, and it does the sort of, this sort of thing, and in I believe already too, certainly Armageddon, if you double press enter, you can do like, I think it's like this, so up and a tiny bit back. It's not quite the same as just turning over and then jumping regularly. And in those, you can also, if you press backspace, you'll jump directly up. I forget what the second, or is that how you get the thing? I don't remember right now. Right. I really appreciate how much customization there is here. There are multiple voices. I just realized I forgot to check how many, but yeah, multiple voices. And in Armageddon, there are even more. There are even, I'm not sure that's a thing before Armageddon, but in Armageddon, you can actually get in different languages. So when I was a kid, I'm Danish from Denmark, so we would use some of the Danish ones, and they were, in fact, at least some of them, made by a well-known Danish children's entertainer. What was his name again? Pyrus, I think. He would make like yeah. There was a thing where he would do stories where he's like a Christmas elf, for example. So yeah, and I will never forget the indignation in his voice. If you harm one of your own worms, hearing his voice call you Judas. And you can customize the what's it called? The gravestone, which pops up each time a worm perishes. That's also something. So I just realized I haven't even mentioned there is no blood in this at any point whatsoever. When a worm perishes on the ground, if they just go underwater, then But if they, right, that's another thing that in this one you don't really see it. In some of the later ones, you do actually see the worm under the water. In this, you just see them go into the water, crack the surface of the worm. Anyway, in this one, and the later ones, if you perish on ground, you see all the number goes down, number goes down. Remember that guy who thought that it was ridiculous that we were responding to right? His original line is number goes up, and he's like imitating a parrot. He's like, oh, look at them repeating this thing. Now let's go repeat exactly what our pastor said, even when it makes no sense, and showing that we clearly don't actually even understand the words. He thought that we shouldn't be noting when COVID was getting worse, because that makes us just like, can't you think for yourself? Can you? Anyway, when the numbers go down in this, if they reach zero, if the health of that's also something I quite appreciate. You can always see how much health the worm. Well, let's see. Once you start moving a worm, you can't see it for that one, but you can see it for all the enemies. So you can tell, okay, if I could shoot either of these, but this one is more likely to die from the damage done. Oh, right. I guess I'll just very briefly note, you yourself can also sometimes place mines, and that's one of those things where if you drop that off a ledge and it lands close enough to an enemy, that's an instant attack. If you just put it somewhere, if you put it right on another worm and you're close enough yourself, you might not be able to get away before it explodes, so keep that in mind. But it can be really useful for dropping off. Oh, right. So, I appreciate the following is culturally insensitive. I'm not making excuses for it. I'm just saying in this game, you can also do a kamikaze attack, which will take out your worm, but can also, it's a trade-off. Because if you are able to take out multiple enemy worms, obviously it's worth it. And it can also just be a fun way to surrender or throw the match. Anyway, yeah. If the number reaches zero, the worm will look directly at the camera, perhaps make a quip, and then use this like TNT thing to blow itself up, and then instead of a corpse there, it's the tombstone, which is also in Armageddon, at least you can choose a tombstone that does basically look like the dead body of a worm, so they appreciate it that some people might think that's funnier, hypothetically, or the funniest, and there's a bunch of different ones in Armageddon. I think that might... Oh, and I mentioned I was not able to find, here in Worms United, a level generator. I don't think the game really needs it. I think it's fine. If you really badly want one of those, Armageddon has it. I forget about 2. It's been so many years since I last played 2. And I think that does get us to the the various levels. Some of them are like pop culture references or such. There's at least one that is genuinely just like this this old culture. Like I don't know if it's maybe ancient Greece or something. But there's also one that is like the Statue of Liberty if she were a worm. So I guess one that would be appropriate under Trump. I mean, we're not going to pretend like there's not some percentage chance, and entirely too high, that someday he will say that he's going to change the Statue of Liberty to maybe have his face or something. And let's see, the AI, they do a really good job on, like, if you are playing against a AI that has a high level of AI intelligence, that's unnecessary, then you will, that can really provide a challenge. That's the thing. Like, if you've gotten to a place where you feel like you can do it, yeah, you can give the enemy great intelligence and 10 times the health you have to start with, Anyway, yeah, and at the same time, the lower ones, it also, if you are just looking for one to practice against, and also, I mean, hypothetically, you could set it to human players if you wanted to, and practice like that, and I mean, and control both of them. But that's obviously moving on. I think that does more or less cover. So the graphics is one of those cases where they very much went for something that would look fun. It's nowhere near photorealistic, but it's not trying to be, and I would not want photorealistic Worms game. I gotta say, it took me a little getting used to that cutscene that I mentioned. Did I mention that the cutscene, it's live action and then also a little bit of Worms animation, so that's, yeah. And I guess I more or less already said it, but it is, yeah, sometimes Worms, if they get pushed slightly, they might go, eh. And yeah, they some of the voices for them are these kind of high-pitched, cutesy. It's that thing of, like, I mean, I already mentioned Looney Tunes. In addition, it at times feels like one of those, like, for smaller children, one that isn't necessarily violent, but yeah, like they'll make, like, I don't know, Pingu or something, children's entertainment where they just make these little noises, sometimes non-verbal ones. And the various weapons sound great. Like, there's a sense of power to everything that is meant to be powerful, and a humorous lack thereof for the ones that are potentially effective but not technically powerful, like the prod. If I recall, it is basically just kind of thing, it's not like an explosion sound. You will learn to either love or hate the sound of a worm falling into water. And the music is also great. It's just this perfect balance between, like, militaristic, but also just light enough kind of thing. And yeah, it is a game that, I mean, if you don't want a challenge, that I'm not saying you're wrong, but during the 90s, a lot of the biggest games were challenging. I appreciate today, so some of them are also, and some of the biggest games today are super challenging, but there are a bunch of games that are beloved today that do not provide a huge challenge. Back in the 90s, that was, I mean, you could find some that weren't that challenging, but they were not the ones that people talked the most about a lot of the time. Well, I guess maybe, I don't know, SimCity and The Sims were big and not necessarily challenging, but yeah, and it will provide a challenge. I already mentioned how, like, if you want some of the biggest challenge, you can set it to, in some of the ones that came after this, you can make it even more, for, asymmetrical and uneven in challenge. But in this, like, if you really want, I mean, yeah, hypothetically, you could make a match where the enemy has 10 times as much health, high AI, and did I mention all weapons unlocked and infinite ammo? And you yourself choose to use the worst stuff at your disposal. Like, maybe you tell yourself, I'm going to win using only prod. That would be extremely challenging. And in some of the later ones, because part of it is just the limitations of the time. In some of the later ones, there are more level types and such, but I didn't get bored with the ones here. You know, I played some matches against AI and every challenge level. And let's see, I think that does more or less cover yeah, the randomization adds to the replayability, and it's of course also one where, you know, since pretty much anyone can just sit down and play, and you can practice completely separately, you know, that's one of the things about, you know, some games, if you just start playing it co-op or multiplayer right out of the box, there's going to be stuff you haven't unlocked yet that makes it much more fun. But if one of you unlocks that and then the other one comes in and hasn't played the game, then there's a huge, you know, disparity in skill. But this one, you know, yeah. And it's also worth noting, if you are not playing every single challenge level in a row, you can use the password system, which also means that if you get to a certain level and then, you know, you have to take a break from that computer, you can play it on anybody else's, you know, as long as it's still Worms United. I did not run into any bugs or glitches other than the slight graphics glitch I already mentioned about Steam in the video. There was at least one video. I don't think it was even more than one. And let's see, I think that does cover, yeah, the challenges. They also do quite a good job on having all of them have some aspect. Like, there's a pretty decent amount, and I would not say any two of them feel like, okay, you had one idea and you felt like doing it more than once or that sort of thing. And yeah, I think that does cover it. So yeah, basically, you know, if you just want to play one of these, I would not make this the one. Of the three I've played so far, I would definitely say Armageddon. But if you are just like someone who likes to go back to see how a game series started, this is one of those where it's not going to be like painful. There's just maybe a little awkwardness. And of course, there's some stuff that was added later. But I'm really glad that I sat down with this. And that's not always the case. There are some of these games where it's like, why did I go back? Why didn't I just heed the warning? Yeah, I rate this 8 humorously endangered worms flying through the air, going into water, being skipped along by multiple mines, perhaps hitting another worm along the way, so they both go tumbling off the edge of the screen or into the water, leading to a hilarious victory out of 10.